A few days ago, Georgia failed to hold a proper election under the challenge of a global pandemic. Understandable. Wisconsin messed theirs up as well last month and probably should have just delayed that election by a month or two. But these failures are due to the unique challenges presented by the pandemic, surely. And everything should be okay by November for the presidential election, right? Because election quality in the United States is top-notch. Or is it? Now, according to the Freedom House Index out of 100, in 3 categories of free, mostly free, or not free, the U.S. gets an 86. It was recently downgraded last year. Now, I don't know that I personally believe that elections in the United States are that free, but we get an internet freedom score of 77, not great. Then there's a category for democratic freedom, with no results for the United States. Now, there are claims of bias in favor of the United States by Freedom House, as the U.S. contributes over 60% of its funding. But let's go with the current score of 86, or a B+. Now, moving into the fall, we have a lot of uncertainty. As we've seen in Georgia and Wisconsin, closed polling places and long lines have led to unrepresentative results. We are already starting to see spikes in cases of the virus, if many have decided to pretend that the pandemic went away all of a sudden in an effort to open the economy again. And there are the protests, of course, as well. As important as they certainly are, they are a petri dish of viral exposure potential. But with the protests being about change, a lot of people are looking to elected officials and the election of new officials to foster the desired change in our policing and public service sectors. So is the United States ready to hold a successful nationwide election in November? Personally, I don't think so. Now, there are many angles to consider, but I want to focus on 2. Influence and confidence. Now, Russian interference in the 2016 election has been a major talking point for over 3 years, and is still very much in the news today. This piece from the New York Times from March 10th describes how the Russians will stoke racial tensions before the election. It links to another article by the Times from 2018 that references New Knowledge, the company that apparently discovered the Russian interference on social media. Well, New Knowledge got caught doing exactly the same thing in a Senate race in Alabama. That's right, using fake accounts to attempt to sway the outcome. Jonathan Morgan from New Knowledge admitted, "We orchestrated an elaborate false flag operation that planted the idea that the More campaign was amplified on social media by a Russian botnet," and added, "The research project was intended to help us understand how these kinds of campaigns operated," said Mr. Morgan. "We thought it was useful to work in the context of a real election, but designed it to have no impact." Now, the company only spent $100,000 in a $51 million race, but that's the same amount that Facebook says the Russians spent in 2016. Now, New Knowledge doesn't exist anymore. They changed their name to Yonder and are apparently using that valuable experience from a research project in a real election to now protect brands like Viacom and Walmart and Disney, offering the service of knowing the invisible forces controlling mainstream opinion. Terrifying. Now, according to Twitter's own security team, in fact, during the 2018 midterms, we saw more domestic attempts to spread disinformation than foreign. So we can't trust the Russians. But we also can't trust ourselves. Remember microtargeting, where you get a tailored ad experience based on your social media profile? And then when you click on that ad, you may even get a different version of the campaign website? Well, according to the LA Times, there's now so much money and attention spent online with so few rules that if you wanted chaos, that's the place to go for chaos, said David Karpf, a political communications professor at George Washington University. And there's a bunch of people who want chaos. So how do you protect yourself against foreign and domestic influence on social media? Well, funny enough, there are 2 bills sitting in Congress for a while now that would certainly help. The Bot Disclosure and Accountability Act of 2019 would aim to regulate the use of automated software programs intended to impersonate human activity on social media. That bill has made no progress since July of last year. And then there is the Honest Ads Act, introduced in 2017, that would aim to make social media ads subject to the same, more rigorous criteria as print and television, and forcing social media companies to maintain public records about the purchase of political ads on their sites. Wow, that sounds really helpful in combating these issues. Well, there's been no movement on that bill since June 2018. So it seems that Congress is not that interested in protecting you from foreign bots or domestic ad buyers. Perhaps they are more interested in abusing the loopholes of social media for their own gain. There's another angle to the issue of influence, what the U.S. does to interfere in other countries' elections. Twitter, for example, has suspended thousands of accounts in other countries, military leaders, opposition leaders, government officials, based on what they deem to be click farm activity. Is that always true? What about social media influence in the Middle East, especially Egypt during the Arab Spring? So who is to say when the influence of such powerful companies like Twitter and Facebook should be allowed? We scream outrage at the Russians for using the platforms against us. But certainly when it is to the benefit of the United States by interfering in other countries' elections, we should applaud the sound democratic judgment of a few super-rich business persons, probably working directly with the Defense Department or the CIA. I also want to take a moment and look back specifically at what the U.S. has done to interfere in the elections of Russia and Ukraine, because those two countries have been in the news the most in terms of our recent elections. That's right, we did it to both of them, and successfully too. Boris Yeltsin in 1996, in a stunning turnaround from 6% approval rating to winning re-election. How did we do it? With lots of money. The single best way to guarantee votes. Pay for them. Now, this embarrassing part of the decline of the Soviet Union at the hands of the West is something I'm sure a younger Vladimir Putin, then working for the KGB, would not quickly forget. How about John McCain and Barack Obama working to subvert a free and fair election in Ukraine in 2014? Here's John McCain standing with the leader of the ultra-right-wing Svoboda Party in support of protests that helped topple a free and fairly elected Viktor Yanukovych, someone the West didn't want in power in Ukraine. Did we forget about that already? That was only 6 years ago. There was a phone call and a transcript back then, too, about whom the U.S. and Europe would prefer in certain Ukrainian offices after the elections, and in fact got the prime minister that we wanted. So I would say that based on the actions of the U.S. in the past, payback alone would warrant Russian and Ukrainian interference in the fall election. If we can't protect and educate our citizens against the tactics we use freely in blatant attacks against democracy in other countries, there may be no hope. And that leads nicely into my other thought, confidence. Will your vote be counted? Will your polling place be open? Will it be sanitary and safe to go there? Will you be able to vote by mail? Now, just before George Floyd, the media was embroiled in a censorship battle when Twitter decided to add tags to a few of President Trump's tweets for the first time. The first tweet specifically was about mail-in voting. Ironically, the warning led to an article as a fact check that then went on to be disproven and corrected. So Twitter had to correct their own correction of the president's tweet. Now, where that censorship starts and stops is for another episode. But Trump was not entirely wrong in his tweet. There are some issues with lost mail-in ballots. Not every state has experience with them, and certainly implementation of such wide-scale changes to our voting system would take time. Are we working on this to be prepared? Or are we just hoping that the virus will be gone by November? Oh, that's right. We're already telling ourselves that the virus has disappeared. What hasn't disappeared? Ridiculous gerrymandered districts like this one and this one. Thousands of people being purged from voter rolls. Polling places closing in poor and minority neighborhoods. Oh, and the fact that at a hackathon for preteens back in 2018, most of them were able to change the results of a computerized voting machine in minutes. Or that 44 lost thumb drives appeared with thousands of missing votes in Dallas back on Super Tuesday. All of these issues existed before the virus and before the protests, and are just a few of the reasons why I don't think the U.S. should get a score of 86 or a B+ from the Freedom House Index. Now look, the virus is going to make this election harder, and the protests show just how important this election is. So what can we do? Well, we can plan on the process taking longer. We could dedicate more voting days, making them holidays, increase absentee voting, reduce lines by alphabetical voting appointments with required time off work, dedicated double redundancy systems for checking mail-in ballots. There are lots of things we can do, but we should have started yesterday. What can you do about influence on social media? Slow down and check yourself. Do you get your news from social media and believe everything it says? Well, you're lazy and reactive. It's okay. Most citizens in the United States are. These days, up to 62% get their news solely from social media. It's just far easier to take everything at face value and have your feelings and reactions decided for you. Now, instead, check for other sources. Even search for opposing viewpoints. If an article comes from a site you've never heard of before, question it even more. Question the mainstream media, too. Experts say or officials say isn't good enough for me. There are also plenty of misleading, sensational headlines that front stories that end up contradicting themselves in the last paragraph if you've bothered to read that far. Most of the pundits on cable news shows used to work in the industry that they are experts in discussing on air. In a real job, that would be a conflict of interest. And if you were presenting at a conference, you would be required to declare that as a conflict at the beginning of a lecture. Now, I'm not asking you to become paranoid that everyone is lying to you all the time, because I don't think that's true. But one of the biggest issues these days is just how easy it is to choose the news and opinions that you want to see without even realizing it. So I don't have a lot of hope. Obama ruined that word for me. And I'm not excited about either presidential candidate. But all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for grabs. 35 out of the 100 seats in the Senate. And maybe most important in terms of enacting the change you could feel right away, your local elections. You want to change policing policy? You probably have a meaningful vote right there at your local level. But you have to do the work. Explore the viewpoints. Be uncomfortable. Get out of your media groupthink bubble. Not only are they not protecting us from ourselves, they're trying to tell us what to think. If we don't stand for it, we might just survive the November election.